Welcome to the Case Memorial Library's first virtual author talk. Thank you all for coming. I am very excited to welcome tonight Libby Copeland. She is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, The New York Times, The New Republic, Esquire.com, and The Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published in March by Abrams Press. Let me let in two more people here. The Lost Family explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, before you spit in that vial, read this book. The Washington Post says, The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? Because we have a large group this evening, I'd like to request that everyone remain muted except for Libby and me. If you have questions, please submit them by way of the chat function. Also, please, by the way, you are welcome to submit your questions. Please be aware that this meeting is being recorded and the chat also will be saved. So without further ado, welcome to Libby Copeland. And Libby, tell me, how did you come to write The Lost Family?
Yeah, so I started writing this book about 3 years ago when I wrote a story for the Washington Post about the unforeseen consequences of DNA testing. It's described as recreational DNA testing, and this is the kind of DNA testing that you often see ads for from companies like Ancestry and 23andMe. The ads will say, you know, test and find where in the world your DNA comes from, test and sort of augment your family story. They've become incredibly popular gifts, particularly right around now, Thanksgiving, the holidays. And they've become things that are just a popular consumer item that people purchase, you know, on a lark because it's on sale, because they want to understand a little bit more about their history and understand sort of what they're made of and how history has shaped them, which is a very, at this particular moment, a very American impulse. And I'm really fascinated by what this particular moment can tell us, you know, why we're so inclined to look backward to understand ourselves right now. That's a very interesting sort of phenomenon. What's interesting about this is both that sometimes people's understandings of themselves is really sort of expanded by what they find when they do a consumer DNA test. When you test, you're basically getting two basic buckets of information. You're getting the ethnicity estimate, which is like a pie chart. You often see that it as the thing that is most advertised. And so basically it's going to tell you where in the world your DNA comes from, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years ago. If you're an American mutt like me, you're going to have a pie chart that has a lot of little different slices from different colors from all over the world. And if your people are all, you know, British colonial, you're just going to have basically a pie that's basically one color, and it's going to tell you about your colonial roots. So the other really interesting thing that happens, in addition to all the family historians and all the genealogists whose research is helped by this, and all the casual, curious people, is that sometimes people discover something isn't exactly what they thought. Sometimes that's a little bit out of remove. Oh, my grandfather, actually, the man I understood as my grandfather wasn't genetically related to me. Oh, okay. Sometimes it's much more immediate. And in the more immediate scenarios is where you see people really struggling with existential questions about identity. So to find out, for instance, that your father wasn't genetically related to you, and that you're made of a stranger, and that basically half of your genetic history is wrong, is a really significant thing for people to discover, particularly if they've grown up with a different narrative and all of a sudden here they are in their 50s or 60s. You have people discovering, in addition to the fact that, might not be related to their dad, they might be discovering that they're adopted and they weren't told, or that they were donor conceived, or that for reasons of assimilation or other, their family had some previously undisclosed genetic ancestry. And sometimes there's an incredible kind of history and story in that hidden genetic ancestry. So I wrote about this phenomenon for the Washington Post back in 2017. And it was the outpouring of response that persuaded me that I needed to write a book, because I had, within a very short amount of time, 400 emails from people all across America and indeed abroad, telling me about their experiences with DNA testing, saying, let me tell you what happened to me. This is how my life has changed irrevocably, profoundly. This has been an incredibly intimate experience, and nobody's telling the story, and I feel all alone. And it was very clear that people were not alone. It was very clear that this was an experience that needed to be explored and normalized, and I really wanted to understand it. So that's how I started writing the book. And I tell many stories in the book. Some of them are ones that actually came to me by way of those readers writing to me. And some of them are stories that I reported my way into.
And I'm certainly glad you did. The story of a woman named Alice Collins Playbook frames your book. And I wonder if you could tell us why her story is such a powerful window into home DNA testing. And while you're doing that, I'm going to see if I can share a picture of
Sure.
Alice.
Yeah. Alice is amazing. And hopefully you can see this picture that I think Jonathan's going to put up. Here she is.
Yep.
So Alice Collins Playbook is this really fascinating woman. She's a great character, but her story is unlike in a fiction book. It's a real life true story. She tested in 2012 at the dawn of the autosomal DNA testing era. So the business of doing DNA testing to understand your family history is exactly 20 years old this year. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago that the particular type of DNA testing that we're all familiar with, the one that gives you your immediate relatives and that ethnicity pie chart, those two buckets of information, the DNA relatives and the pie chart, it wasn't until about 10 years ago that came on the scene. And so Alice tested with a company called Ancestry in 2012. They had actually just unveiled their autosomal DNA test. And she didn't know how good it was going to be, how reliable it was going to be, but she was, like many people who tested back in the day, a serious genealogist who just was looking to, augment her information and break through some brick walls, which a lot of genealogists, use it for that purpose. So Alice, like many people who come away with a surprise, went in assuming that she knew what she was going to find. She believed herself to be of Irish ancestry. She grew up in a large Irish Catholic family. There are 7 Collins siblings. And, they had a very strong sense of ethnic pride and ethnic identity, which was why the test was so surprising, because what she found was that instead of a pie chart that was basically all one color, it was split down the middle. Half of it was this Irish genetic ancestry that she expected. The other half was Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, who have a very specific genetic signature, because in addition to Judaism being a religion, it is of course a culture and an ethnic group. And they have, we have, I should say, because I'm half Ashkenazi Jewish, a very specific sort of genetic signature that looks different from someone who is of Irish genetic ancestry, or Nigerian, or Swedish, or what have you. So Alice's response at first was to assume that ancestry had messed up because the test was so new and it was still in beta testing. And so she figured they don't know what they're doing. And she even went so far as to write them a nasty note and say, you guys don't know what you're doing. But of course, Ancestry knew what it was doing. And you see this in many of the stories that have come out over the last 10 years of people being surprised. At first they're in denial. They assume that the company is wrong. The company is almost never wrong. You hear stories of people hoping, wishing that they've mixed up a vial. They haven't mixed up a vial. It's we who have our stories so wrong for a variety of reasons that I explore in the book. So Alice assumes once she starts to investigate it and take it seriously, her first theory is that she's the product of what's known in this world as an NPE, which stands for non-paternity event, or not parent expected. Sometimes it's known by the acronym MPE for misattributed parentage experience. And the fact that I have so many acronyms should tell you that this is a very common experience. It's by no means the majority of people who test, but it is a significant minority, probably around 2% of the population. And if you go onto one of the many Facebook support groups that exist for people who've experienced a DNA surprise, you will just see over and over people saying, I've discovered I'm an NPE. I'm an NPE, and you'll see the phrase over and over. So statistically, that would be the most likely scenario for a situation in which you test and half of your genetic ancestry is quote unquote wrong, right? Or not what you expect. But Alice is basically a scientist at heart. She's someone who has worked with data and information processing all her life, is very methodical, very analytical, and she is able to eliminate that theory through scientific research and through testing her siblings. The other thing that she's also able to eliminate are the other theories that would be the common explanations for her situation. So for instance, she's not donor conceived, she's not adopted. Adoption is another thing that she explores, but she's quickly able to eliminate that. And she doesn't come from a community that hid its genetic ancestry. She believes at one point that perhaps her people were Irish Jews, that maybe they were a group of people who hid their Judaism, or maybe they came over and they were Jews who decided to pretend to be Irish. I mean, she's throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what will stick. The explanation when it comes after 2.5 years of basically great genetic detective work. And it is so surprising that it's just a complete sort of shock and so unusual. And it turns out that the explanation for this surprise goes back 100 years. And I won't say what it is, but one of the joys of reporting the story was spending time with Alice, who's really funny and really smart. And one of the other joys was getting to research back 100 years to the particular setting that explained her unexpected genetic ancestry. And I have a short reading about Alice that I wanted to read because Jonathan and I were talking earlier and I was just going on about Alice and how cool she is. I got to do a lot of traveling for this book. And one of the things I got to do was travel out to Washington State, where she lives, and spend some time with her. And this is a little reading that explains why she was uniquely suited to solve her own existential mystery. Over the years, I've thought a lot about Alice's brain, how for decades she honed certain skills involving technological efficiency and problem solving, so that when the time came for her to answer the most important question of all, she dug in like she'd been training for it. When she was growing up, her family was not wealthy. No matter how many overtime shifts her dad worked, there were still 7 kids to care for. So she put herself through college, washing dishes and tutoring kids in math, and sewing her own clothes to save money. In time, she worked for a professor as a key puncher, putting information onto computer cards to be fed into a mainframe computer, and quickly demonstrated what a college friend describes as a natural feel for crunching data on those finicky machines. She got a degree in political science at the University of California, Riverside, specializing in statistical analysis, and nearly finished a master's degree in political science. In 1971, she married Bruce Playbook, who studied philosophy in grad school and later became a lawyer. The same year, she got a job working as a clerk for the University of California, Santa Barbara. There, Alice stumbled on a problem in need of solving. Faculty members' records were on card files, and a small staff spent an inordinate amount of time tracking and updating their salaries and academic advancements. Alice had the idea to put this information onto early computers. This set a pattern and became the focus of her career in a series of positions in the field of information systems and data processing throughout the University of California system, where she worked with personnel files, payroll systems, and benefits enrollment, facets of working life that most of us only notice when they're clunky and broken. Early on, Alice was part of a rising cadre of women in a male-dominated environment. She asked her boss for a title and salary to match her responsibilities. She said, "You know, if you had a man doing this, you'd be paying him a lot more." And she got the first of many promotions. And she kept making suggestions for how things could be better. It sure would be a lot nicer if we had things automated. And when the internet came along, it sure would be cool if people could access their benefits online. All that data could be put to better use if only someone were willing to tame it. And Alice was just the woman for the job. "I'm not intimidated by lots of data," she told me. She'd always been good at math and science. As a kid, if a problem stumped her, she'd go to sleep and wake up with the answer. She can see the big picture, but she also notices the details. She told me it used to piss off one of her programmers, the way she could scroll through acres of his work and glimpse the one error that would mean a whole program wouldn't work. She could do it quickly, just by picking out what she called the nits. Alice has been retired for many years. She stopped working in her late 50s, the result of financial planning and good retirement benefits. But she remains an early adopter of new technologies. In 2007, before anyone had an iPhone, she flew to the Macworld Expo in San Francisco to cradle the prototype in her arms. She had the first model the very day it became available, and still does with every new iPhone. And when the thing happened that set everything into motion and changed Alice's life, this was also the result of her love of new technologies. Alice being Alice, she could not leave a puzzle unsolved, no matter how difficult it was or how troubling its implications. She could not. And that's Alice.
That was great. Thank you. So home DNA testing is a fascinating thing because on one level, it seems kind of a consumer phenomenon. It might be a holiday gift. And at the same time, it can reveal things that shake people's life. So how can it be both of those things?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. You know, it's both of those things because sometimes when we are testing, we don't realize the sort of world of possibility that is presented to us in the results, or we kind of don't realize what question we're asking, if that makes any sense. I was able to go to Texas to interview the founder of one of the oldest company of DNA testing for ancestry in the US, which sent out its first test kits exactly 20 years ago. And he said he sometimes tells people, if you don't want to know the answer to the question, don't ask the question. But the reality is we don't know we're asking, right? If you decide to test because you get a kit as a gift for Hanukkah or Christmas, as I did, or because you see that it's on sale. You know, it's normally $99, but it's $59 right now. I gotta get my hands on it before I lose that sale. You are often assuming that what you're going to find comes with a certain amount of, kind of emotional and chronological remove, right? So you're testing because you're curious, sure, and you're hoping for a surprise of a kind of innocuous sort. Wouldn't it be cool if I found out I was 2% this? Or maybe I could confirm, what my great grandmother apparently supposedly used to say about Native American ancestry or something like that. A lot of people test because they're just curious about confirming something like that. Or I never knew what my grandfather was. It would be cool to find out. And when you test, there's a kind of cautionary language, sometimes repeated multiple times when you test. And the cautionary language will say, you may find unexpected relatives, or you may discover things about yourself and your family that you weren't prepared for. But in my interviews with people, I found that people didn't usually assume that would apply to them. Mm-hmm. Unless they came into this technology with a question, which is another category of people that does exist. they assumed they knew what there was to find, and that they were just gonna, get a little bit more granular, or a little bit more specific about a particular ancestor. And so then suddenly to discover that a full sister is matching as a half sister, or a previously unknown half brother is showing up in the database in your top on your list of genetic relatives, and you're like, what? Is more than you asked for sometimes, right? And opens up those sorts of questions about the context for how is this relationship, how does this relationship exist? How did it come to be? So it is, it is something that, you can have sort of a low investment in the beginning, and kind of low expectations for, and then be absolutely blown away by what you find in terms of its meaning to your life.
Yeah. So sort of another angle on the same question. You say in the book, one of the realities of technological advances is that their true impact is hard to anticipate. In fact, you have a great quote from Margaret Atwood that every great advance has a good side and a bad side, and I think a stupid side that nobody anticipates. So could you elaborate on how that's true for home DNA testing?
Yeah, so it helps to go back to kind of the beginning of the industry to think about how this industry started and how little all of us could have anticipated where it has gone. It was founded, as I said, 20 years ago, when I went down to Texas to interview Bennett Greenspan, the founder of the oldest company, which is called Family Tree DNA. He told me that he founded the company basically because he had a genealogical problem he couldn't solve. He was a genealogist. He was trying to figure out the precise connection to a supposed relative who lived in Argentina, and the paper record couldn't prove it. And he had hit, what genealogists call a brick wall, and he was incredibly frustrated. And he realized, because he was reading scientific papers at the time about something called Y DNA, which is the DNA in a man's Y chromosome that he inherits from his father, that a Y DNA test would solve it. And it was the late 90s, and there was research being done on the Y chromosome. And so he figured that he could just buy one of these DNA kits that was being used in a scientific setting. And he actually called a scientist who was doing this work at home on a Sunday and asked the guy if he could buy one from him. And the guy was like, no, that's not a thing, right? We don't sell that. But Bennett Greenspan happened to be, in addition to being a genealogist who had a problem, he also happened to be a serial entrepreneur. So he basically had a sixth sense for an opportunity. He had a sudden realization that if there were people out there who like him, who for whom this would answer a question, maybe he could sell these things. And he actually managed to convince this scientist, after some follow-up, to go into business with him. And he started selling these kits. And what he told me was that, in the beginning, it was really like such a niche product. It was a product for genealogists like him. And even the genealogists weren't necessarily flocking to it. I mean, they were into it. If you were a serious hobbyist, you knew about it, but it wasn't necessarily selling, hand over fist, certainly compared to now. He said in the very beginning, he would go to genealogy conferences and he would meet people and he would try to explain to them what his product was. You can do DNA testing on a man's Y chromosome. And as well, in the beginning, they were doing mitochondrial DNA. So it was different kinds of DNA that was going to tell you more about your ancient origins, but could be helpful for some family history research questions. And he said, people were not necessarily interested, and he would shake someone's hand and then he would walk backwards toward his booth and he wouldn't let go, and he would just keep talking, so that they would sort of be forced to come towards his booth. And then he figured if he was, if they were in proximity to his product, maybe they would buy it. And that's kind of the first 10 years of the industry. And then you see autosomal come on the scene. And that really was a game changer, because what happened is first 23andMe offered it, Family Tree DNA, the oldest company, started offering autosomal, and Ancestry got in on the game. And Ancestry in particular started putting a lot of money into advertising. So in 2016, Ancestry spent, according to the numbers I found from a media analyst company, $100 million in advertising in 1 year. In 2017, they did it again. And if you are familiar with the ubiquity of Ancestry ads and Ancestry DNA ads, you have a firsthand look at what those ad dollars bought, which is this messaging about this idea of the kind of rootless American who's separated from the past by assimilation, and whatever forces of time and forgetting, and now is looking backwards. And that is, actually does describe in many ways the moment that we're in. But those ads were just so incredibly effective that it moved out of the realm of genealogists and into the realm of the casual consumer. And, casual consumers, and I count myself as one of them in the beginning, we don't necessarily even know what this product is offering us. I know a lot of people who tested, not even knowing it was going to give them a list of genetic relatives, which is often where the surprises come, just knowing about the ethnicity estimate. The other thing about casual consumers is we are not necessarily familiar with the surprises of family history the way that genealogists are. Genealogists have been working on it. They know that sometimes the records are in conflict, or the timing of things isn't exactly, what you would expect. And they kind of they're kind of familiar enough with it that they know that this is what can happen. They know that family history research can throw up these kind of surprises. Oh, actually, she was married twice. She was married once before she was married to my grandfather. That kind of thing. Casual consumers are not always as familiar with that. And so they're often really, really surprised when they test and they see someone unfamiliar, a close, unfamiliar relative in the database.
I'd like to remind everybody that if you have questions for Libby Copeland, please type them into the chat window, and we'll pass them along to her. It seems like at this point, more than 35 million Americans have taken a home DNA test. And in the book, you say that that means America has reached a tipping point. Could you tell us what you mean by that? What the implications?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's 35 million consumers, although only the majority of those are American. So some of them are abroad in places like the UK and Canada and Australia. It's still maybe 70 to 80% US. So the majority of people in the databases are American. And that probably works out to somewhere around 7 to 8% of the US population. And just to give you a sense of the kind of expansiveness of the growth, when I started writing my book 3 years ago in 2017, there were 8 million people in the 4 major companies' databases. So the 4 major companies are Ancestry, which has the biggest database, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. And that's basically in descending order, descending size of databases. And they're all in the millions. So back in 2017, if you added up all the numbers across the databases, you had about 8 million people. 2 years later, you had 30. And now you have 35 million. So, that's kind of a mind-boggling growth. So what does it mean if approximately between, say, 7.5 or 8.5% of the US population is in the database? It means that everyone on this Zoom call has many, many relatives in the databases. And they could be distant relatives, but there are also closer relatives, perhaps second and first cousins, perhaps closer. People that you know and people whose names you've never heard of, but who share genetic material with you have made a decision to test. And in some ways that means that you don't have the choice to opt out of this technology anymore. And that's because because of the nature of shared genetic data, there are things within your family that that may come out, and they will come out whether or not you test. In other words, you don't get the choice to opt out anymore. So, so what does that mean? It means, you know, a woman tests and she discovers surprising results and unravels what it means, and finally concludes that it means that her mother was donor conceived. Now, her mother never tested, but now she is in the perhaps uncomfortable position of having to decide whether to tell her mother. Okay. It means a sister tests and discovers that her brother has a child that perhaps he didn't know existed. You know, that is certainly one hypothetical, but if you think about it, it doesn't need to be a close relative who tests in order for something like that to come out. So even, for instance, a third cousin to this man that we're talking about who had a child in high school and doesn't know it, you know, that third cousin testing could potentially be enough for his adult child to figure out his identity based on that match and doing genealogical research. So basically, it's not a matter of if, but when that, you know, these genetic secrets become part of our family conversations. And that is really, really meaningful and good for a lot of people, because it means they get to know the truth of their genetic identities. And I spent a lot of time talking to people about how important that is. But it also means that some people, particularly those from older generations, are going to feel threatened by this. They may have been keeping a secret for a very long time that they would really rather not come out. They may be the children of somebody who was keeping a secret or maybe didn't even know. And they feel incredibly threatened by this narrative that contradicts their sacred narrative about their family or about their parent. And so what I wanted to do for the book, I use Alice's compelling story with its twists and turns and its surprise ending. I use her as sort of the spine of the book. But then along the way, I explore, you know, what does it look like to discover you're the product of a non-paternity event? What does it look like to discover you're donor conceived and you have many, many siblings? And I tell those stories, and I try, when possible, to tell them as a 360. So how do I feel as the person who's discovering it? How does the person on the other side feel? Like, what is it like when I'm writing my letter to them? And then how do they receive that letter or Facebook message or Twitter direct message or whatever, however I choose to make contact. And sometimes you have really kind of gorgeous stories of families coming together and talking through these difficulties. And sometimes two people who are intimately genetically related, like a father and a child, find their interests to be diametrically opposed, right? The child wants contact, the father feels threatened by it, or his children do, or his wife does. And those stories are moving as well, and usually, you know, extremely sad for the person who is seeking to make contact with genetic kin.
Yeah. So it's a whole new landscape, really.
Yeah.
So we have some questions coming in, and here's one question that two of our audience members have asked independently, which is to talk about the use of DNA testing to solve crimes and cold cases.
Yeah. So 2 years ago in April of 2018, probably most people on this call are familiar with the Golden State Killer case. That's when the arrest was made of the man named D'Angelo, who was then a suspect in the Golden State, suspected of being the Golden State Killer, who has now pled guilty. He pled guilty over the summer, and he committed 13 homicides that we know of, and I believe over 50 rapes. He was at one point a police officer. He was at large primarily in the 70s and I think in the 80s. And he was never a suspect. And so this was a cold case that police were working forever trying to keep it warm. And they were trying to use the DNA for a very long time, but the type of DNA that they were using was using the basically a law enforcement system known as CODIS, which looks at a kind of a different way of looking at the DNA. And it matches in a different fashion, and it does not generally allow for what's known as familial searching. So, it's just looking at basically other offenders, for the most part, who are already in an existing database and matching people who are closely related. The power of looking at DNA that's been gathered for ancestry purposes is that you can find a first cousin match. And so what happened is that there was a third-party website called GEDmatch, which was a place where genetic genealogists and DNA hobbyists could take their information once they tested at one of these big companies, and they could download it from one of those big companies. They could upload it to this website, and they could do all sorts of cool tricks with their DNA, and they could also compare across databases. So my sister tested it 23andMe and I tested it Ancestry, and we would want to pay for another test, but the two systems don't talk to each other. We just upload for free and we can compare and see, see each other in the system. Now, the techniques that were used to solve the Golden State Killer case had been used for many, many years to help adoptees find their birth family. So the techniques themselves weren't new. What was new in 2018 was the use of this technique to solve a cold case, and the police going into GEDmatch, because it was kind of a openly accessible sort of third-party website. They could get in there and they could basically upload like a sample of crime scene DNA and treat it like it was a person, and then try and match it to cousins, which they were able to find, some distant cousins, and then take those matches and basically eventually figure out the identity of the suspect, which was mind-blowing. And it's now been used in, by the estimate of the genetic genealogist who solved that case, Barbara Ray Venter, it's been used in over 200 cold cases since. Some of them go back to the 50s, and some of them even further. And there are cases where there was DNA, but they were never able to be solved. And it definitely provoked privacy questions around, was this a fair use of information gathered for genealogical purposes? For the most part, people now know if their DNA is being used that way, because GEDmatch and now Family Tree DNA, which also allows law enforcement use, has like policies where you can opt in or opt out of this kind of use. But there are privacy experts who say, this could be, maybe this amounts to overreach, government overreach, and is more of a fishing expedition than is fair, and maybe it's a violation of the spirit of the Fourth Amendment. But you're seeing convictions, and you're not seeing it really tested in court, so it hasn't really been attacked. I should say that when they make a match through this system, it's treated as a tip. It's not like the person is then arrested based on the sleuthing that the genetic genealogist does in a site like GEDmatch. The police then have to take something that the suspect discarded, like a straw, that they throw away in a garbage can in a public place, and then they have to match that to the crime scene data, make a definitive match to then make the arrest.
Now, here's a different question from Dana Hanford. How is ethnicity determined in DNA testing?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. There's two kinds of science in your DNA testing, and one is relative matching and one is ethnicity estimates, and they're different. They're relying on different techniques. So relative matching is really solid. So they can really tell how closely related someone is to you. A half sister doesn't, I should say a third cousin doesn't look like a half sister, and vice versa, right? They can tell based on your amount of shared genetic material, for the most part, how related, how much related you are to someone, even if they can't determine the nature of the actual relationship. But ethnicity estimates are different because a lot of them are the art of interpretation. And they rely on two basic factors. One is the reference population that a company uses for each population that they're saying that they're going to be able to predict that you are or aren't. So it could be like, it could be like all of Sweden, or it could be all of, all of Japan. They've got many hundreds or thousands of people who have deep roots in that area. They've looked at their DNA and they're saying, this is what a Japanese person looks like. Or maybe they'll break down even more to regions within that area. And depending on the size of the reference population, they may have a better samples because they have thousands of people versus maybe another company doesn't have that many people. And then the other thing is they have an algorithm. Each company has a different algorithm, and they're constantly updating these algorithms. So if you've tested and you've gotten results, and then 6 months later you get an update, that's because they're tweaking it. They're tweaking their algorithm, and they may be growing the reference population as well. Mm-hmm. And it's not as if, I should say 99.5% of our DNA is identical. And what we're really looking for is, is the places where we're different, and they're testing those places that are different. But it's not as if the particular places are so obviously different. It's not like you can look at a specific chemical letter or the SNPs that they're looking at and say in isolation that is Korean. It's a matter of understanding the context of where it is placed and interpreting it along with the rest of the things that they're seeing. And so sometimes they're not right. And you'll get an update and it'll say you are, like I got at one point, I was 1% Korean, and it disappeared eventually. And now I have none of that. And for a while I was like, how does that, that's amazing. Like, I want to know more. How did this Korean ancestor intersect with my Ashkenazi Jewish forebears? Yeah. Well, she or he didn't, because she or he didn't exist.
Interesting. Okay. Here's a question from Martha Tobin. When you buy one of these home testing kits, are you agreeing in the fine print to allow your DNA result to be accessed by many agencies, including national and international criminal databases and the like?
No. So the three majors, to Ancestry, 23andMe, and MyHeritage, are very much not wanting, say, law enforcement to access this information, because they're concerned that if that happens, then they will lose customers. So they're very devoted to basically fighting, law enforcement encroachment. And they say, we require a valid, warrant or subpoena. 23andMe goes so far as to say we will fight that. We will resist it if we can. So if you read, you will see what you're basically granting is you're giving your consent or not, and you have the choice to have this information used for research. 23andMe, for instance, which has they all have a health related product at this point, but 23andMe has always been known for that. They have a very robust group of people who have tested and answer questions, and they can go back to and ask them more questions so that they can study their DNA, so that they can, come up with pharmaceutical cures for things, or pharmaceutical medicine and things like that.
Yeah.
So you can decide that you can delete your information. There may be some sharing of that information, that personal information, not genetic information, as far as I know, with like third parties for marketing purposes, is my understanding, depending on which company you go with, and you kind of have to read the fine print. But they're hoping, I think, that that information stays siloed, and I would imagine their worst fear would be like a hack or a breach, which a lot of consumers' worst fear also would be. And a lot of people that I talk to who don't want to test, they don't want to test because they're afraid of that, which makes sense. What happens to this information if it gets hacked? How telling it is, it's hard to say. It's kind of hard to interpret those results. But that's a fair concern. Another concern people have is, family secrets. What's going to come out? Am I going to be responsible for those skeletons in the closet kind of coming out? And that's also valid. And the third concern people have is, what happens 10, 20, 30 years down the line if my company where I tested and I liked their privacy policies and I felt I was consenting to everything and I was comfortable with it, but they get purchased by some other company with a different policy. And these companies aren't really regulated by themselves. For the most part, this is not like medical information gets protected by HIPAA, which is like a Health Privacy Protection Act. Like we don't have that for consumer DNA with the genetic information that you spit into a vial and you get your results. So could there be some theoretical future where that information is, to your mind, misused by another company because they purchased the company that you tested with? That is certainly within the realm of possibility. And so when people say, I don't want to test because I have privacy concerns, my response is that makes sense, because even though I have tested in multiple places and it's been helpful to me in understanding my family history, I also can say, I don't know what I don't know, and I can't predict the future.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't try to persuade someone otherwise.
Yeah. Karen Jr. would like to know, do you have any feeling or insight into children who are donor conceived regarding at what age they might become interested in meeting their biological fathers? Do you think that teens are just as interested as adults, or do you think that as children age into adulthood, their interest in their fathers increases?
I can't answer that question. It's a really good question. And I would guess that there's somebody who studied it who could say. What I can say is that the practice of not telling your child that they're donor conceived, was really common 60, 70, 50 years ago, 40 years ago even. And that's really changed. And for the same reason that, more openness around adoption has also changed, the research that I've seen indicates that it's much better for the kids to know at an early age where they come from. And that wasn't always the thinking. In fact, back in the day, doctors felt in some cases that it would destroy the bond between father and child for them, either of them, to know they weren't genetically related. So there were practices at work like mixing the husband's sperm with the donor's sperm to give them both parents and the doctor, I suppose, plausible deniability. So no, they would never truly know. And nobody foresaw this, right? Nobody foresaw DNA. Not even, I tell the story in my book of like a donor who donated in the 1970s and actually did a DNA test because the daughters that he raised gave him one, never even realizing that he was going to get a list of genetic relatives. He just thought it was an ethnicity estimate. And lo and behold, his children start popping up, and he has 22 donor conceived children in addition to his two that he raised. And so I would say, I don't know at what age you become more interested. I'm sure it varies from person to person. But there's a psychologist I interviewed who worked with people who are adopted, and he said that everyone searches. Now, the definition of searches can vary. Some people want contact with their birth parents or their genetic parents, and some may not. But everyone wants to know a little bit more, which makes a certain amount of sense to me. That we want to know where we come from. We want that medical information. I think it's hard to write your own story if you don't know the very beginning of it.
So here's a question from Kathy Giotsis, who says, I heard that if you get a transplant, your DNA can change to be that of your donor. Is that true? Is that something that you've heard about?
I've read a little bit about this, but I can't say whether I know that's true or not. Being a journalist, not a genetic genealogist, I sometimes get really great questions and I have to say, darn it, I don't know the answer, right? Ask a genetic genealogist. But I think I've seen some language about that, but I couldn't say for sure, so.
Might depend on where you take the sample from, I suppose. I just thought of a question, actually. Ancestry is one of the big DNA testing concerns. It's also the name of a very popular database that we subscribe to at the library, a genealogical database. Do you happen to know if those are the same people?
Yeah, Ancestry DNA and Ancestry are the same people. And I was able to tour their headquarters in Lehi, Utah, back in 2018 when you could travel. And it was really cool. I don't know if any other journalists been inside there. I haven't seen anyone else in there. So what's amazing, and I talk a good deal in the book about Ancestry and their business model and their beginnings. And what's amazing is kind of the synergy between the subscription database that they offer and the DNA test. So, you know, you test, but then of course, in addition to wanting to see who you're related to, which comes with the cost of the test, you also want to be able to do some research. You want to be able to access some trees that you can't access without subscribing. And so you kind of get a little bit sucked in. And you know, the process of writing the book was definitely one of actually getting sucked in as well. And increasingly, you know, what happens with people getting into genealogy is that they go in through the DNA testing door, as opposed to being longtime genealogists who test to get around a brick wall. And so our family is somewhat like that. You know, my dad was always into genealogy, but for me, I did a DNA test and all of a sudden it was like, wow, how much information. This is astonishing. And when I went out to Utah, you know, I saw sort of Ancestry's operations and how they work well together. And then I was able to drive about half an hour to Salt Lake City and go to the Family History Library, which is run by the LDS Church, the Mormon Church, who have religious reasons for being very into genealogy and for offering their genealogical records for free online at familysearch.org, which you can check out. And your library probably offers that as well, although it's free, so you can also get it at home. You know, I basically found, I was reporting for the book, but there were these helpful genealogical volunteers there, and they kept asking me questions. I decided to do a little research while I was there, and they would come up to me and they would say, can I help you with anything? And I would say, yeah, I'm just trying to figure out this one question about my great-grandmother. And I got basically passed between a series of volunteer genealogists, and I lost all this time where I had no idea what time it was. It was, you know, I looked up and 5 hours had passed and I had found out for the first time all this information about my mother's side of the family, my great-grandmother's parents' names, which we'd never had. And it was just like mind-blowing. And then I looked up and I realized it was completely dark outside, and I didn't realize, I wasn't sure if I had actually was going to be able to get my car, if it was locked in because the garage had closed, and I ran out of there. So, you know, I think a lot of people have this experience nowadays because, you know, there's 35 million people in the databases. There's literally billions of records available online, tens of billions. And there's never been a moment for genealogy like this before. There's never been a moment when the past is as present or as immediate or as with, you know, accessible. And I think in many ways, this is the era of genetic reckoning. You know, this is the era when, you know, we finally get our questions answered about what really happened. And sometimes that's disheartening, and sometimes it's beautiful, and sometimes it's both at the same time.
Now, from a business point of view, at the same time as the pool of information has gotten bigger, it seems like their pool of potential consumers might be dwindling a little bit because they've saturated the market. And I wonder, can you comment on that and what they might be thinking of doing next?
Yeah, so if you looked at the growth chart of the DNA test kits, you would see this really steep, unsustainable slope in the last few years. And then it's still growing, but it's kind of not exactly plateaued because it's not flat, but it's growing at a much lesser slope. And the thinking is that that is potentially connected to a couple of factors. I'm just going to pause because somebody is, maybe we can mute. Nope, can't. Okay, can't do it. Maybe you can do it, Jonathan.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you. So one potential factor is that people, you know, like you said, basically the market's been saturated. People who were particularly interested in family history research and willing to buy a kit for 99 bucks, you know, those people have bought their kits, and sometimes they bought them at multiple companies, like as I have. You know, the other factor is there may be privacy concerns, particularly in the wake of the Golden State Killer. So what you're seeing is the companies pivoting towards more health-related testing. 23andMe was always known for this, but now the other major companies are offering it too. And as that happens, the databases will continue to get bigger and people will continue to find family, but they'll be going into it potentially if the companies, you know, have made their calculations right. And if people are interested in this, they'll be going into it because they want to find out more about their health, and perhaps they have a physician helping them with this kind of testing, because there's kind of a coming together of the medical establishment and the recreational DNA testing industry. And then they will still, through that means, be finding out more about their own histories, their own medical predispositions, and also about their families. So it's not going away, but it may be kind of morphing into something that is not just ancestry, but also health.
Do you have any advice for people who are thinking about taking a home DNA test?
I think the advice is probably more for people who, maybe more for people who are in a position to tell someone something important about themselves. Because I think, you know, you can choose to test or not to test. But if your reason for not testing is that you don't want your child to find out that they were donor conceived, for instance, that's sort of not in your control anymore, because somebody in that family may test. It might be your child, it might be your child's child, and the news will probably come out at some point. And so, and the interviews I've done with people suggest that they would much rather find out from a loved one than from a computer screen, that there's some essential facet of their identity that's really radically different than they were told. So I think, you know, to use that phrase, genetic reckoning again, I think this may be the moment when we have to have difficult conversations that we never had, right? Where we say, honey, I have something to tell you. And I made the decision not to tell you a long time ago, and it made a lot of sense then, but the context has totally changed now. And not to criticize anyone who made that decision, because culture was different. There were stigmas about certain things that are really not stigmatized anymore. There was psychological guidance around how people should do things that's radically different than it is now. So people made decisions to keep certain things from their children. But now we're in this other era, and we need to start talking about the things that people were not told.
If you wouldn't mind, we have one more question,
Sure.
which is from Phyllis, asking, would you expect the same results from multiple companies?
Yes and no. The differences are going to come with the fact that different people have tested at different companies. So, you know, if you know your sister tested at 23andMe and you tested Ancestry, you're not going to see her there. You have to test at the same company, right? So you're going to get different relatives. And sometimes people who are really searching for answers will test at multiple companies because they want to see if they can get a really close cousin or a really close relative at one of them and not at another. They're going to, you know, sort of distribute their DNA across all the databases. The ethnicity estimates are going to vary also. And that goes back to the thing I was talking about earlier with the different ways that the companies calculate your results based on their different algorithms and their different reference populations. So it's important to take that with a grain of salt. You know, if one company tells you you're 13% German and another company tells you you're 26% German, it's not like your essential Germanness has changed. It's just very hard to make those calculations when, you know, borders have changed, definitions of nation states have changed, right? There was not a Germany back 500 to 1,000 years ago. It was something else. And populations don't stay static. They intermarry, they move around, you know, and populations are often very similar to each other. And so particularly, you know, within Europe, companies are trying to parse you know, the data to an incredibly granular degree. They can't always tell, you know, between two populations, between French and German. So, you know, it's important to take those with a grain of salt, and to recognize that they're very different from your relative estimates that, or your relative results, your relative matches are solid, and your ethnicity estimates are good, but not perfect, and they're going to change and hopefully get better over time.
Yeah. Well, I want to express the thanks of the Case Memorial Library to Libby Copeland for being so generous with her time and for writing this book. If you haven't read the book, you should definitely read a copy from the library, and you should also buy a copy. And thank you to all of you in the audience for coming and sharing this evening with us. Our next virtual author talk will be on December 14th. It'll be Neil Thomas Proto, the author of Fearless, A. Bartlett Giamatti, and the Struggle for Fairness in America. And I hope to see you all there. And with that, I will close, and thanks again to everybody.
Thank you so much.
All righty.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.